This is the week of April 29, 2019, and you're tuned into The Revolution. In today's episode, you'll be hearing a series of articles that appear in this week's edition of RevCom.us Revolution newspaper, the voice of the Revolutionary Communist Party, USA. They have no answer on immigration. The revolution does. In their own perverted way, the representatives of this system, from Trump all the way to Bernie Sanders, have hit on a truth. They all say that this system of theirs faces a massive crisis over immigration. In that, they are right. Where they are wrong, and or lying, is that 1. It is their system that has caused and made worse this crisis. 2. Their system has no answers to it. And 3. The revolution does. We'll get to that answer, the solution to the crisis, in a minute. But first, let's be clear on the problem. Imperialism is a system where a handful of quote-unquote advanced capitalist countries in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia dominate and exploit the whole rest of the world. The capitalists and then the imperialists have plundered the resources and people of South and Central America, Asia, and Africa for 5 centuries. These international gangsters have ripped apart the societies and deformed and dominated the economies of people after people, country after country. Constant wars and occupations, almost all of which can be laid at the doorsteps of the imperialist powers, create yet further misery. To top it all, the destruction of the environment, overwhelmingly the fault of these imperialist powers, in the US in particular, gives rise to massive drought and makes many of these countries unable to grow food and other necessities. Because of all this, tens of millions of human beings in these countries cannot survive and are desperately seeking a haven in the countries that are responsible for their suffering. Tomorrow, it will be hundreds of millions, and after that, billions. Think about it. And think about what you would do in their situation. Starvation or the threat of death by government or gang violence makes people take risks. Just around the US-Mexico border, hundreds of people die every single year in the desert, seeking to evade the heartless border patrols, inflaming, distorting, and concealing, all in a day's work for representatives of this system. And what do the representatives of this system have to say? The fascist Trump blames the immigrants themselves. He whips his base into a frenzy of hatred against them. He fans the flames of white supremacy still higher and weaponizes it for his whole fascist program. The liberals may differ on the optics, and they have some actual differences, but what is most striking is what they share with Trump. Remember, Obama set the record for deportations and told everybody after the elections that he and Trump were quote-unquote on the same team. He worked with Central American countries to stop immigrants before they even got to the border. This week, the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman said he too wants a wall, but he wants to let in quote-unquote high IQ immigrants. He puts the liberal logic out there very plainly, quote, "In an era where more and more countries will fracture under environmental, population, criminal, and technological stresses, we simply cannot take everyone who shows up at our border," end quote. Friedman conceals the fact that these stresses are caused by imperialism, and he doesn't dare spell out the consequences of his conclusion that the huge majority of people who are kept out of the US should shut up and literally drop dead, so that the gated communities of the imperialist countries continue to gorge themselves with a clear conscience. Bullshit from Bernie, or BS from BS. And then there's the so-called radical Bernie Sanders. In his epic pander session on Fox News, Sanders said, quote, "We need border security. Of course we do. Who argues with that? That goes without saying. I happen to believe that there are more cost-effective ways to do that than simply building a wall." End quote. Who argues with that? We argue with that. Take that first sentence. Just who the hell is the we BS refers to? We, the privileged Americans who consume 25% of the world's resources with just 5% of its people? Or we, the more than 7 billion on this planet? Border security? Give us a break, BS. Tell it to the Native Americans and Mexicans whose land the U.S. ripped off through force. Tell it to the Vietnamese, the Iraqis, the Afghans, and the masses in the dozens of other countries that the U.S. has invaded. In Iowa last year, Sanders went further, answering a question on quote-unquote open borders. Quote, "If your point is you open the borders, my God, there's a lot of poverty in the world, and you're going to have people from all over the world. I don't think that's something we can do at this point. We can't do it." End quote. The American chauvinism, willful ignorance, and selfishness just drips from his every sentence. So, from right to so-called left, and all stops in between, every single one of these representatives ends up in the same place. Let millions die, either from starvation or death in the deserts or on the sea. There is an answer. But the revolution does have an answer. It's in the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America by Bob Avakian. The Constitution goes through the history of immigration in the USA and the way in which today great numbers of immigrants were driven to the U.S., many of whom were not able to secure legal entry and consequently were forced to live in the shadows and remain vulnerable to extreme exploitation as well as to discrimination and to violence and terror carried out by the state and by mobs encouraged by reactionary policies, actions, and statements of the government and government officials. And how this was used to make things even worse. The Constitution goes on to lay out the rules of citizenship, that anyone residing in the territory of the New Socialist Republic at the time of its founding will be citizens, except for those who led the counter-revolution, or committed war crimes and/or other crimes against humanity. And there are procedures outlined for people seeking residency, asylum, and citizenship. But the main point is this: the orientation of the New Socialist Republic in North America is to welcome immigrants from all over the world who have a sincere desire to contribute to the goals and objectives of this republic. The rules to facilitate this on the right basis are then laid out. But the basic orientation is clear, and it is not miles apart, but a whole world away from what the imperialist representatives, even the most radical among them, stand for. Coming from that understanding, revolutionaries must join with others in fierce and determined resistance to the outrages now happening, and this can have a powerful effect on how millions see what is possible. In doing so, and in going to people who are either passive or confused in the face of this, the movement for revolution must clearly make the point: either live with what would be continued and worsening persecution of people who have been driven from their homelands by this criminal system, shutting your eyes and ears against the bones and tears of your fellow human beings, or make revolution. The choice and the responsibility is yours. Revolution, Intellectuals, and the Beginning of a New Approach. From a member of the National Revolution Tour. As part of the national tour for revolution, we have been meeting professors on campuses. While too soon to draw firm conclusions, these very initial observations are worth sharing. The two choices, a radically different approach. As someone who has been involved in this movement for a while, what was striking was the radically different approach to the professors. Proceeding straight up with revolution, the two choices resulting from Basics 3.1, what we do have in the strengths of the revolution, and what we don't have in people we need, involving them, and getting their thinking on the problems of the revolution in this context. This is a different framework and approach than anything in the past, and it opens up an entirely different conversation with very different questions, unleashing a different process on different terms. Proceeding from this, and the 5 stops setting forth the need and basis for revolution, set terms on what is objective and what is objectively needed, versus remnants of our thing. A relative openness, seriousness, attractiveness of the national tour. In this process, a couple of factors on relative openness come into sharper relief. To be clear, this is a relatively small sample and somewhat self-selecting, and who were intrigued by and turned their faces toward the National Revolution Tour, but still worth noting. First, most are shocked and horrified by the moment, and where things are headed with everything Trump represents, and a dawning realization that nothing fundamentally good or lasting came off Obama. Compounding all this, global warming is a major factor, a real sense of the scale and scope of potential devastation, the systemic nature of this versus small problem solution being proffered, and nothing remotely commensurate. Second, with all the contradictions, like heightened individualism among students, a few sense a perceptible shift in how students are looking at things, concentrating this in a comment. Quote, "You don't see it on the surface yet, but if there's a moment to organize for a revolution, this is it." Talking about a very perceptible shift in mood among the students, instinctual response to capitalism, saying it's much more, of course capitalism is bad, and a beginning openness to alternatives that she has, quote, not seen in decades of teaching and interacting with students, end quote. Third, there is a genuine curiosity, to varying degrees and in different ways, about Bob Avakian, the revolution, and the national tour to organize for an actual revolution, the last being a compelling factor in actually meeting. Given the leading approach, BA comes into sharper relief, including around the positive alternative concentrated in the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America, the strategy for revolution, and the overarching framework of the new communism. A few asked up front, "Tell me about Bob Avakian," and had a lot of serious and substantive follow-ups. Others who had some familiarity wanted to learn more about the new communism, with probing questions. They were all intrigued by the tour, what it is doing, especially on crossing the tracks, as one put it, and that even while we are on campus, we were out at Nipsey Hussle's funeral and neighborhood. Most really wanted to know, what was your message, how was it received, etc. This was very attractive to them. Some would go on to comment on how insulating the campus is, etc. In different ways, the bankruptcy of other solutions and frameworks among the more thoughtful was starkly evident. When I mentioned what Bernie Sanders has said about the border and immigrants, one of the professors put his head in his hands. I said, all that this means and reveals is they have no answer. And he said, I know, but it's still distressing to hear it being said so baldly. Another said the Green New Deal is lying to people about what it will take in radically changing U.S. consumption patterns. On identity politics and intersectionality, one professor commented that this, quote, just reflects back the world we live in, end quote. When we pointed out the harm, he readily agreed, especially the focus on me, me, me. Another ranted on Oppression Olympics. It's about who is going to be the winner, and this is a debate long overdue. I'm really glad you guys are finally taking this on. Others were more reserved, seeing how this challenge to a dominant framework on campus plays out. Some immediate follow-up questions on the necessity, viability, and strategy of making revolution revolved around whether we can actually win, given their strengths in repression and weaponry. On how do you go about transforming people's thinking en masse when they have control over mass media and the internet? And can you consciously work towards a revolutionary situation like the 60s, or does it just emerge spontaneously? Those who were serious were intrigued to watch the film from BA on why we need an actual revolution and how we can really win, and to learn more, even while some initial answers were provided, that they found serious and provocative. One further thing I realized is that the intangibility of seriousness counts for a lot. Not posturing, but plain spoken about what we do and what we don't have goes a long way. Especially that there are principles, there is strategy, and then there is a need for people to go to work on and solve these problems, applying the overall strategy. I mentioned the tech wizards example from BA's speech, the real need from the perspective of making revolution, and this had a good effect. When I posed the question of how do we crack this campus, attracting and cohering students, people, and what stands in the way, there were many who commented on individualism, further exacerbated with social media, and people not feeling in any way part of the collective. Identifying this puts it much more in the collective realm for grappling, as part of building this movement for revolution. Moving forward, while too many of these have begun as individual meetings, we have to figure out how to forge networks with collective forms, contributing to the aims and objectives of the tour. We are in the beginning phases of unleashing a process, what we have not done ever before with this approach, or in any consistent fashion, and there is the need to lead this as part of an overall collective process. You can find these articles and so much more, including the works and vision of Bob Avakian, at revcom.us, the voice of the Revolutionary Communist Party, USA. Funds are urgently needed each month to maintain, upgrade, and expand revcom.us. Sustain or donate generously now. We urge our listeners to take up, study, and organize others around the points of attention for the revolution. Join the Revolution Club in your area, or link up with the leadership of the movement through revcom.us. Become part of the movement to put the new communism on the map and change everything. The emancipation of all humanity. This, and nothing less than this, is our goal.